Gather round, children. Your Uncle Steve is going to tell you a story. Until a few decades ago, and I know this is going to sound totally unbelievable, but you'll just have to trust me on this, the United States and Russia were enemies. Technically, it wasn't the United States and Russia. It was the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union, which were enemies. The Soviet Union, known more officially as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, was a multinational communist state of which Russia was the largest and most prominent constituent republic. The United States, being the world's largest and most influential democratic capitalist state, and the Soviet Union being the world's foremost communist state, the two countries were adversaries for most of the time the Soviet Union existed. After fighting on the same side against the Axis powers during World War II, the US and the Soviet Union grew apart as each side sought to consolidate its power and protect its interests in the post-war years, and this led to a rise in tensions between the two countries that came to be known as the Cold War. There was never direct conflict between the US and the Soviets. The American military never fought against the military of the USSR, but they competed against each other on virtually every front imaginable. They did fight each other via proxy wars, they spied on each other, and at times their rivalry almost resulted in exchanges of nuclear weapons. It was pretty awful for everyone. And when the Cold War finally ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, that was generally regarded as a good thing. And yet, there are some perspectives from which one could view this monumental turn of events as a bad thing. I'm going to explore one of those perspectives in this video, as I ponder the question, did the end of the Cold War actually hurt Star Trek? When Star Trek debuted 60 years ago in the fall of 1966, the Cold War touched all facets of American life. It was the underlying motivation behind multiple stories that dominated the news on a daily basis: the ongoing Vietnam War, the space program, political and military turmoil in the Caribbean, which the staunchly anti-communist United States government was largely responsible for. Small wonder, then, that it also became the organizing narrative of a sci-fi action-adventure show that sought to use stories of aliens and distant planets to tell us about ourselves. The future presented in Star Trek is, in many ways, very different from the present day. Humanity is more peaceful, more united, no longer held back by our own ignorance and prejudice and fear of each other. But in other ways, the world inhabited by Captain Kirk, Spock, and the others aboard the Starship Enterprise is a lot like the world the people who watched them on TV in the late 1960s were living in. The United Federation of Planets, the vast interstellar alliance that empowered Starfleet, the service in which Kirk, Spock, and the other heroes are officers, is diverse, democratic, egalitarian, and largely peaceful, at least internally. There are many real-world organizations onto which you can map the Federation, the United Nations, NATO. It's obvious that the Federation represents Western civilization in general, but more specifically, I think it's clear, given where Star Trek was produced and for what audience it was primarily produced, that the Federation is a stand-in for the United States. The Federation is how the United States sees itself, the greatest nation, the stronghold of freedom. Opposing the Federation, occasionally engaging them in armed conflict, and always competing with them for control of the galaxy, are the Klingons. The Klingon Empire is militaristic, authoritarian, and aggressively expansionist. The Klingons represent the Soviet Union. Again, specifically the Soviet Union as perceived from the United States. In addition to the Klingons, there are the Romulans, who are also militaristic and authoritarian, but aren't as expansionist or confrontational as the Klingons. Romulans in Star Trek: The Original Series seem more concerned with security and isolationism. They can also be read as analogs of the Soviets, but because of their differences with the Klingons, perhaps they make more accurate stand-ins for Communist China. Powerful, remote, mysterious, untrustworthy. Yep, that sounds like the American view of China. All right. The Romulans are important, but the main recurring conflict in Star Trek, the original series, is between the Federation and the Klingons, and that conflict is an allegory of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. In the classic episode Errand of Mercy, the Klingons are introduced, and the terms which will define their feud with the Federation for the following decades are set. As armed conflict between the two sides breaks out, the Federation, represented by Captain Kirk and the crew of the Enterprise, and the Klingons, represented by the forces commanded by Kor, race to take control of the strategically crucial planet Organia. But the natives there, the Organians, have a little surprise. Though they appear to be an ordinary, human-like species, living simple lives in a pre-industrial society, they are actually godlike beings. When the Organians get to know the Klingons and the people from the Federation, they come to regard them as equally irresponsible and warlike, and they take it upon themselves to impose peace. Through their powers, the Organians make it impossible for the Federation and the Klingons to take up arms against each other. In real life, it wasn't a race of gods, but rather the fear of nuclear war and mutual destruction that kept the United States and the Soviet Union from escalating their rivalry into a direct, full-scale war. But the situations are similar. Like the US and the Soviets, the Federation and the Klingons can't or won't engage each other in overt warfare, but they still have competing interests and what they believe are irreconcilable differences, so they carry on their conflict in other ways. One of those ways was competing for control of other countries, not by conquering them militarily, as the Klingons attempted to do with Organia, but through soft power, political influence, military support, and so forth. In the real world, the United States government viewed the spread of communism as an existential threat and justified interference in the affairs of other countries using what was termed domino theory, which predicted that if one country became communist, its neighbors would inevitably fall to communism as well. Though I don't remember it ever being referred to as such on screen, the Federation's actions relative to the Klingons during Star Trek the original series are motivated by the equivalent of domino theory. In the Season 2 episode, A Private Little War, the series' most explicit Vietnam War allegory, the crew of the Enterprise discovers the Klingons have found a loophole in the peace treaty forced on them by the Organians and are secretly arming one faction of the native inhabitants of a primitive planet. Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are on the surface of the planet taking a survey, and Kirk is like, "Isn't this place great? I fell in love with it when I was here many years ago as a lieutenant. It's like the Garden of Eden, and the inhabitants are so peaceful and live very simply, hunting with bows and arrows, never fighting each other. I'm just so happy that this place is so tranquil and always will be forever." Then some of those peaceful inhabitants show up brandishing flintlock guns, and one of them shoots Spock. Kirk's like, "What the hell? They're not supposed to have guns? Where'd they get the guns?" It turns out the Klingons gave them the guns, but they only gave guns to the villagers, not the hill people, who are still equipped only with bows and arrows. Not wanting the Klingons to establish a foothold on the planet, Kirk begins providing flintlocks to the hill people, telling an angrily disapproving Dr. McCoy that their best move is to try and maintain a balance of power. Part of Kirk's motivation is humanitarian, to prevent the villagers from wiping out the hill people, but there's clearly also a political element to his calculation here. If the Klingons succeed in helping one faction destroy the other, then the Klingons will have secured control of the planet without ever firing a shot of their own. Kirk is eager to prevent that, to stop Klingon imperial influence from extending to yet another world. And he succeeds, but only in the sense that he's able to maintain a stalemate between the villagers and the hill people. The Klingons don't lose, but they are prevented from winning. The domino doesn't fall. Competing through soft power and proxy wars was a major part of the conflict between the US and the USSR during the Cold War, but there was also a lot of spying and sabotage going on from both sides. We see a depiction of Cold War espionage in the classic Trek episode The Trouble with Tribbles, a beloved and lighthearted comedy episode that sees the Federation and the Klingons once again competing for control of a strategically valuable planet. At the center of the dispute is Sherman's planet, which both the Federation and the Klingons claim and which, according to the Organian Peace Treaty, will be governed by whichever power can most efficiently develop it. The Federation's strategy for developing Sherman's planet involves a specially engineered, high-yield grain called quadrotriticale. That famous shot of Captain Kirk buried up to his chest in Tribbles, the one image everyone remembers from this episode, that happens because the Tribbles get into a storage compartment containing the grain, and the grim detail about that, which we usually forget because we'd rather focus on how much fun it is to see Kirk in the middle of a big pile of fuzzballs, is that most of those Tribbles are dead because the grain has been poisoned. Sabotage. Sabotage. In the end, it's revealed that Arn Darvin, a Klingon agent masquerading as a human, poisoned the grain. If not for the Tribbles, the poisoned grain would have been sent to Sherman's planet, where it would have caused the catastrophic failure of the Federation's development efforts, thus guaranteeing that the Klingon Empire would claim the planet. Espionage, sabotage, and let's throw in the attempted use of a bioweapon for good measure, too. The real Cold War ended in the early 1990s, and that's when the on-screen Cold War between the Federation and the Klingons ended too. Coincidence? I'll let you decide, but it always seemed a little too convenient to me. The film Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country is about what happens when two nations who have been enemies for decades finally try to make peace. It's a great movie, one of the best of all the Star Trek movies, and it's packed with allusions to the Cold War. The inciting incident of the film, the destruction of the Klingon moon Praxis, can be read as representing the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which occurred in 1986 and hastened the collapse of the already declining Soviet Union. The Klingon leader, Chancellor Gorkin, is a stand-in for Gorbachev, the Soviet leader who pursued peace with the United States and eventually presided over the end of the Soviet Union. The scenario of the film is evocative of the circumstances that led up to the end of the Cold War, with the Klingon Empire's social and economic instability mirroring that of the Soviet Union, forcing the Klingons to end hostilities against the Federation in order to survive. Not everyone welcomes the coming peace. Captain Kirk is dubious and is still carrying a lot of deeply felt prejudice against the Klingons. General Chang, a senior member of Gorkin's staff, is also against the idea of his people and the Federation ever being anything but enemies, and takes part in a conspiracy to sabotage the peace process. During a tense dinner aboard the Enterprise with both Kirk's and Gorkin's senior officers, Kirk attempts to express his skepticism in a diplomatic way, but Chang interrupts him and says, "No need to mince words, Captain. In space, all warriors are cold warriors." Just in case you needed it spelled out. Oh, and then at the end, when the evil conspiracy has been thwarted and the Klingons and the Federation stand on the precipice of establishing a lasting peace, Captain Kirk gives his big speech and says, "Some people think the future means the end of history." That phrase was not randomly chosen. In 1989, the political scientist Francis Fukuyama wrote an essay titled "The End of History," which was later expanded into a book, in which he argues that the imminent end of the Cold War signals the end of what he calls mankind's ideological evolution, and the triumph of Western-style liberal democracy as the final form of human government. And he was right, and everybody lived in peace from then on. The end of history. Well, the excessive optimism of certain political scientists, whom I just referenced a few seconds ago aside, it's undeniable that Star Trek VI, like much of the Star Trek produced in the decades before it, was a Cold War allegory. It was also the final film to center on the classic Trek cast, and despite my little jokey joke from a couple of minutes ago, that was not a coincidence. Star Trek VI was the concluding chapter of the original version of Star Trek, and it was being made as the real-life Cold War, which was the basis for classic Trek's unifying narrative, was also coming to an end. What else could Star Trek VI have been about? With the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union winding down, the resolution of the long-running conflict between the Federation and the Klingons was as much of a natural endpoint as Star Trek was ever going to get. Star Trek VI was made while the TV series Star Trek The Next Generation was in production, and an important element of that show was shaped by real-world events related to the Cold War as well. Though the Soviet Union had not yet fallen when Star Trek TNG debuted in 1987, the writing was on the wall. Diplomatic relations between the US and the USSR had been thawing throughout the 1980s. Soviet leader Gorbachev pursued a policy called glasnost, meaning transparency, which allowed for greater communication and cooperation with other governments, including the US. For the first time since World War II, it seemed plausible that the Americans and the Soviets could work with rather than against each other. The status quo of Star Trek TNG reflects this hopeful outlook. Taking place roughly a century after the era of Star Trek the original series, the Federation and the Klingons, as depicted in TNG, have gone from entrenched enemies to uneasy allies. They aren't the best of friends. There's still a lot of cultural distance to be closed between them, but they are no longer at war. They are cooperating with each other rather than competing, and just as Russian Ensign Chekhov served on the bridge of Captain Kirk's Enterprise to point toward a post-Cold War future, Captain Picard's bridge includes a Klingon, Worf, to represent this new era of peace. This new era of peace, I should add, in which, in agreement with Fukuyama's vision of the future, the enlightened, democratic Federation enjoys unprecedented prosperity and is unquestionably the dominant power in its region of the galaxy. For most of its first 30 years, Star Trek, like the real world which it reflected, was defined by the Cold War. That doesn't mean every single Star Trek episode or movie was a Cold War allegory. The Cold War allegory was not an ongoing serialized storyline that ran through the series and the movies. The vast majority of Star Trek stories produced during that time had nothing to do with the Cold War. But the most important recurring conflict, the Federation versus the Klingons, was a Cold War allegory, and the overall state of affairs of the world in which those Star Trek stories took place was modeled after the real-world global state of affairs during the Cold War. It wasn't the only subject, or even the main subject most of the time, but it served as the basis for organizing the setting and defining the relationships of the major players that was recognizable and relevant. And it provided an ongoing, extended metaphor that gave the events that took place within Star Trek's fictional world meaning in this one. It was like the cosmic microwave background of the series. Then the Cold War ended, and that extended metaphor went away, and Star Trek hasn't really been the same since. I'm not saying that there hasn't been any good Star Trek since the end of the Cold War. That's not the argument, and if you've watched any significant amount of my Star Trek stuff before, you know that's not my opinion. There has been some outstanding Star Trek produced post-Cold War on the TV and the feature film sides of the franchise. Every series has done good work, and some have done positively great work from the 1990s on through the current era. It hasn't all been good, but a lot of it has been. The absence of the Cold War metaphor has not prevented good Star Trek from being made. I'm also not saying that I wish the Cold War had never ended for the sake of Star Trek. It would be truly deranged to prioritize the quality of a TV show above political and social conditions that affect the lives of billions of people living in the real world. What I am saying is, despite the fact that there has been some excellent Star Trek produced since the early 1990s, it feels like the franchise has lost something. The Cold War ended, and that organizing narrative at the center of Star Trek went away, and it hasn't really been replaced by anything else. And as a result, when seen from a long view, The franchise appears scattered, aimless, compared to how it looked during its first 3 decades. Now, on one hand, you might reasonably ask, is this Star Trek's fault? The creators of Star Trek didn't end the Cold War, it ended. When it did, yes, Star Trek lost its unifying narrative, but so did the real world. Or at least it lost what had arguably been the dominant unifying narrative of the previous half-century. For a while, the 1990s felt like a post-history era. Long-standing political relationships realigned. The world felt less fraught and relatively peaceful, generally speaking. Star Trek, produced in the 1990s, continued to concern itself with important real-world issues: racism, homophobia, terrorism. The most important recurring antagonists on TNG are the Borg, a powerful species that exists and acts as a single consciousness, with individual Borg merely being drones that serve the hive. This individualism versus collectivism conflict can be read as an analogy of the real-world conflict between democracy and authoritarianism, but it's more philosophical than political and doesn't match real-world conflicts as neatly as the Federation and the Klingons mapped onto the US and the Soviets during the Cold War. The premise of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, the series that followed TNG, initially centers on the aftermath of a decades-long brutal occupation of the planet Bajor by the militant regime of the Cardassians, a situation with clear parallels to both the Holocaust and the Israel-Palestine conflict. Other recurring themes on Deep Space Nine with real-world significance included secularism versus religion, some pretty pointed critiques of capitalism, including one of the strongest and most unambiguous arguments in favor of organized labor I've ever seen on television, and the high cost of war, especially when it comes to the physical and mental health of those who fight it. Eventually, the major threat in Deep Space Nine is the Dominion, an invading power from the other side of the galaxy, which is joined by a vulnerable Cardassia seeking to regain its former strength and glory. Before that, the primary recurring antagonists were the Maquis, a group of resistance fighters who were mainly opposed to the Cardassians, but who would do battle with the Federation too, if necessary. From the Cold War allegory of the classic Trek era to the post-history period of diplomacy and cooperation in TNG, to a time when the most immediate threats to the Federation were aggressive, fading superpowers and unpredictable non-state actors, Deep Space Nine offered a view of the galaxy that was much closer to the real world in the late 90s and early 2000s. Gone was the mostly peaceful status quo of the TNG years. In its place was a world permeated by constant tension and turmoil, when the Federation faced threats on multiple fronts, internal and external, to not only its dominance, but to its very existence. It seems, as Captain Kirk says at the end of Star Trek VI, that we haven't run out of history quite yet. Damn, that Captain Kirk. He was right about everything. Except when he was being racist about Klingons. Normally a really enlightened guy, but get him started on Klingons and suddenly he starts sounding like Detective Sipowicz. But he worked through his racism, and he got over it. And unlike Detective Sipowicz, who took 12 seasons of network television to get past his personal bigotry, Kirk only needed 1 movie. Take that, Sipowicz! In your face! I'm only teasing. I love you, Sipowicz. Apart from the inveterate racism. Like I said, a lot of this post-Cold War stuff is really good. A lot of what the Star Trek series and films that came after Deep Space Nine did and are doing is good. Even Voyager did good stuff. Occasionally. But there's no unifying narrative. There's no central allegory that is returned to again and again to remind us that the world of Star Trek is a reflection of our world. There's certainly no unifying narrative at the franchise level, and there's not really one for any of the individual series either. Deep Space Nine cycles through a couple of potential central narratives. There's the Bajor-Cardassia situation, there's the conflict with the Maquis, then there's the war with the Dominion that becomes the unifying narrative of the last few seasons, but that's the last few seasons. Voyager never really has one. Its writers seemingly abandoned any potential unifying narratives the moment after they thought of them. I think it must have been a game they played in the writer's room to keep themselves from resorting to cannibalism. Enterprise is kind of an exception to the post-Cold War pattern, partially because it has an explicit war on terror allegory as the unifying narrative for its third season, when some aliens do a space 9/11 to Earth and Captain Archer's Enterprise is dispatched into uncharted territory on a mission to prevent those aliens from doing a second, even bigger space 9/11. It's like Zero Dark 30, only with aliens 7 times as long and about a tenth as good. The more recent Star Trek series of the streaming era are similarly scattershot when it comes to unifying narratives. Discovery brushes up against some concepts with real-world relevance. The Klingon antagonists of Season 1 are in part a commentary on the political movement surrounding Donald Trump and the dangers of nationalism and weaponized nostalgia. The main villain of Season 2 winds up being a powerful rogue AI, which feels relevant to our present moment somehow. Season 3 ultimately makes an argument against isolationism, even in times of national crisis. Season 4 is about how prioritizing communication and understanding ahead of aggression can bridge apparently untraversable gaps between people. But Discovery's long-form storytelling is so shaky and inconsistent that none of those really lands as a cohesive, season-defining idea. Star Trek Picard has the same problem. There are some very promising ideas mixed in throughout its 3 seasons, ideas that could have been unifying narratives with real-world significance, a Romulan refugee crisis, and a population of wrongly vilified androids in Season 1, a violent encounter between a time-traveling member of Picard's crew and 21st century American immigration agents in Season 2, and in Season 3, the way the infiltration of Starfleet by both changelings and the Borg shatters the trust on which the institution is based and parallels the real-life cultural impact of generative AI and deepfakes, which makes it more difficult than ever to separate the authentic from the convincingly fabricated. But it never feels like the series or any season of the series is actually about any of those. I could cite similar examples from Strange New Worlds and Starfleet Academy and the other recent Star Trek shows, but you get the idea. There are stories that carry through entire seasons, there are themes that resonate with our own experience, but there's nothing that renders the world the characters live in as a metaphor for our world like the Cold War allegory did. It's not as if the real world hasn't provided the creators of Star Trek with plenty of potential sources for new unifying narratives since the Cold War ended. In the years following 9/11, it seemed like the war on terror was going to be the big ongoing thing that provided the context for everything else. As I already mentioned, Enterprise did 1 season on it, but 1 season was it. And in real life, the war on terror eventually receded into the background for most of us. I guess technically, it's still going on, though it's so vaguely defined who can tell. Whatever you think of the war on terror now in 2026, its longevity and scope fall far short of the Cold War, which was a constant source of low-key dread and occasionally a source of acute panic for billions of people for decades. The war on terror's centrality in our own lives, and as a central metaphor for Star Trek, turned out to be short-lived. Both of which I'm fine with, by the way. I was never a huge fan of Enterprise's Xindi arc, or the War on Terror. But I digress. Hey, how about this one? Climate change. As far as grand narratives of human existence go, our civilization is doomed because we're wrecking the planet and refusing to stop isn't super encouraging, but it's hard to get away from. Climate change is an even more inescapable cultural singularity than the Cold War was, because it involves not merely geopolitical conditions, but the condition of Earth itself. The conflict between the United States and the USSR could have led to a global catastrophe had things gone a different way. Climate change is a global catastrophe, one that is ongoing even as we speak. Or as I speak, anyway. Are you speaking? You shouldn't be. You should be listening. and watching. You should be looking at me. I wore my special Star Trek hat and everything. You think I walk around with this thing on every day? No. I wear this for you. Anyway, Star Trek has touched on climate change here and there, but not extensively. There's no equivalent phenomenon in the world of Star Trek, an all-encompassing threat to civilization, which is also caused by the activities of that civilization, which everyone living in that civilization has to deal with whether they want to or not. Climate change is probably the strongest choice for a new grand narrative, but there are other options. How about the rise of right-wing extremism around the world? That's been kind of a theme in recent history, hasn't it? Donald Trump in the United States, xenophobia and nationalism leading to Brexit in the United Kingdom, the rise to power of Bolsonaro in Brazil, Milei in Argentina, the increasing popularity of the National Rally, formerly the National Front in France, and the AfD in Germany. I could go on. It's not great. It's more than a little alarming, especially since much of this right-wing resurgence seems to be a reaction to social progress brought about by the liberal democracies which Fukuyama declared to be the final form of human government. Another possible source for a unifying narrative of the Star Trek universe is the global rise of anti-immigrant and refugee sentiment and xenophobia. Here in the United States and throughout the rest of the world, immigrants and refugees are persecuted, vilified, blamed for the problems of their societies. This is nothing new, but it does seem to be a lot more prominent and a lot more mainstream than it was back in the 90s. Actually, one of the major factors driving people to leave their home countries and become refugees somewhere else is climate change. And another major factor is persecution or oppression at the hands of right-wing authoritarian governments. And one of the things those right-wing extremists are reacting to in order to fuel the spread of their movements is environmental regulations imposed to respond to climate change. So eventually it all comes back to climate change. It's an all-encompassing, globally relevant crisis that threatens the futures and demands the attention and cooperation of governments and individuals all over the world. Just do climate change, Star Trek. Shit. I suspect there are some of you who aren't with me on this, who regard this entire video as me going off on a tangent about something only I care about. Fair enough. And I don't know, maybe that's true. Does a Star Trek show or the Star Trek franchise as a whole need a unifying grand narrative that reflects a major real-world issue? No. I judge each individual episode or movie on its own merits, and as long as that episode or movie is good, I'm a happy Star Trek fan. But when I do zoom out and take in a series or a production era or the entirety of Star Trek, I can't help but feel that there is something important missing in the franchise's post-Cold War output. There's lots of good and great Star Trek from the past 30 or so years, but it's been a long time since it felt like the world in which the Star Trek characters exist had a zeitgeist. Modern Star Trek has been reluctant to center any other subject as a master narrative in the way the franchise once centered the Cold War. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's the result of conscious creative decisions on the parts of writers and producers, or if it's something that just sort of happened, or didn't happen, I guess. But I have noticed an important difference between climate change, right-wing populism, the persecution of immigrants and refugees, and other more recent global problems, and the Cold War. The difference is, the Cold War was safe. What I mean by that is, from an American Western side, the lines were clearly drawn. Remember, despite its international popularity, Star Trek is an American production made first and foremost for an American audience. You can spin a Cold War narrative and take the American side, or the allegorical equivalent of the American side, and most of the people in that American audience are going to be just fine with it. In the conflict with the Klingons, the Federation and Starfleet, which represent the United States and the West, are depicted as the clear and inarguable heroes of the story. Sure, they're not perfect. In Errand of Mercy, the Organians don't consider the Federation to be any better, or indeed any different, than the Klingons. And in Star Trek VI, we see that there are people on the Federation side of things just as committed to sabotaging the peace process as some of the Klingons are. But even in such a warts and all portrayal, the Federation is presented as morally and ideologically superior to the Klingons. We are the good guys. How do you make us the good guys in a story about climate change? How do you craft a climate change metaphor for the Star Trek universe that doesn't implicate the Federation? If you care about representing the subject honestly, you don't. You can't. And sure, you might argue that presenting a Cold War allegory in a way that makes the Americans and the West the unambiguous heroes of the story isn't honest, or is at least extremely biased, and that's true. But the Cold War was a political conflict that encompassed many different perspectives. Climate change is a fact. If you choose to tell a story about it, you are acknowledging that fact. And once you do that, again, if you're honest about it, you're also acknowledging that there aren't multiple sides to that story. A version of Star Trek that uses climate change for the same purpose that the original series used the Cold War, as a unifying narrative that shapes the story world, wouldn't be able to present the Federation as the good guys, because any accurate metaphor representing climate change would have to present the Federation as responsible for the problem, just as the United States shares responsibility for climate change with the other industrialized nations of the world. Making an allegory for climate change the new grand narrative of Star Trek would require showing the audience a version of the Federation that is confronted with a long-term existential threat which it helped to create, and either rallies to effectively respond to that threat or fails to. It doesn't present the Federation or the United States and the West, which the Federation represents, in a very reassuring light, which is fine by me, and is actually more than enough reason to do it from where I'm sitting. I want Star Trek to be challenging. I want Star Trek to shine a spotlight on our shortcomings and mistakes and call on us to do better. That's what Star Trek is for. That's why it endures. That's what makes it more than just an entertaining sci-fi adventure show. But doing that is risky. Make the show too pointed of a critique, too challenging, and it could alienate the audience. And here's the unfortunate thing about mainstream entertainment. It's controlled by people who are terrified of the audience. I'm not necessarily talking about the writers, the producers, the creatives who actually work on the show. Take off the leash and give them the freedom to tell whatever stories they want, and I bet good money they'd come up with some daring, provocative Star Trek. I'm talking about the higher-ups, the executives, the people who view movies and TV shows exclusively as products to be sold, and who reduce the audience to demographic categories. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to challenge the audience. They want to make the audience happy, so the audience will continue to buy their products, which makes sense from a commercial point of view. But it's also why people with that mindset are the absolute worst people who could ever hold sway over something like Star Trek. Gene Roddenberry's original pitch, written more than 60 years ago, began with the words, "Star Trek is." And from that moment until this one, Star Trek has been many different things. One of the most important things Star Trek has been is a mirror. It shows us who we could someday become if we're able to grow beyond our fear and intolerance and short-sighted, petty concerns, but it also shows us who we are. I think that mirror should reflect not only who we are, but the world we have made for ourselves. It would help Star Trek dramatically, and it would help it to feel more pertinent. There has been outstanding work produced throughout the entirety of Star Trek's history, but comparing its first 30 years to its last 30 years, it's clear to me that the franchise benefited greatly from using the Cold War as an overarching paradigm and has been missing something in the absence of such a paradigm. We are facing so many large-scale crises, social, political, environmental, some of which, like climate change, constitute existential threats to our species. When we look into Star Trek's mirror, we should see that. We should see the heroes of Star Trek living in a world with daunting and unavoidable problems which resemble our own. It wouldn't be feel-good television. It wouldn't be reassuring or comforting. It would be challenging. But I think the writers of Star Trek are up to that challenge. History didn't end. It moved on. We're still living it every second. Maybe watching the heroes of Star Trek confront their problems will motivate more of us to try and do something about our problems. We can use all the help we can get. Hey folks, hope you enjoyed this one. I'm going to let you know what the subject of the next Trek Actually video is going to be, but before I do that, I want to give shout-outs to some of my newest Patreon patrons and channel members. First, the new patrons. They are Atomic Dwarf, thanks Atomic Dwarf, Ian Murphy, thanks Ian, JP, thanks JP, Ray, thanks Ray, Lizard Bro, thanks Lizard Bro, Genetically Engineered Chicken, thanks Genetically Engineered Chicken, Richard DePizol, thanks Richard, Anon, thanks Anon, BB Galini, thanks BB Galini, Zafra Whitcomb, thanks Zafra, Liam Lenahan, thanks Liam, Wilbert Von Demon, thanks Wilbert, Chris Draper, thanks Chris. This is usually the point where I shout out new channel members, but I don't have any new channel members to shout out this month. However, I did have several channel members who rejoined. I don't do shout outs for members who have rejoined because presumably I already shouted them out when they joined the first time, but consider this a collective shout out to all of you who recently rejoined as members. And by the way, let me also thank all of you who have become members and patrons at levels below the shout-out threshold. I set a bar for shout-outs to incentivize people to choose to contribute more, but that doesn't mean I don't appreciate you folks who are kind enough to send any amount of support my way, even if it's only $1 a month. It counts, it helps, and I thank you for it from the bottom of my heart. If you want to support this channel, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives or clicking the join button to become a member of this channel. All patrons and members get access to exclusive posts that allow you to vote in the polls that determine upcoming Trek Actually topics, and also submit questions ahead of time for my twice monthly Ask Away live streams. If you pledge $5 a month or more on Patreon, or become a member at the $5 a month tier or higher, you get a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. If you'd rather give a one-time gift than a recurring monthly contribution, you're always more than welcome to do that by clicking the thanks button right below the video, or via PayPal or Venmo. The links for those are in the video description. Many thanks. If you like what I do on YouTube, especially the Star Trek related stuff, you should also check out my side projects, the Ensign's Log, the Star Trek themed comedy podcast that I'm on alongside Jason Harding and Amanda Billings, and Trek Reluctantly, the watch-along stream Dana Cole and I do every Wednesday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern on this channel right here. As always, links in the description. Now, for next month's Regulation Trek Actually topic, one of the things I enjoy about this series is the scope of it. This time, we looked at the franchise as a whole, and we do that a lot, but sometimes we zero in on a particular corner of Star Trek and put it under a microscope. And that's what we're going to do next month. The topic will be a particular series, and even more specifically than that, a particular concept, a group of characters from that series. It's not my favorite series, as regular viewers know, but I am happy to give it credit where I think it is due. Will next month be one of those occasions? You'll find out when you watch the video, which will be my attempt to answer the question, were Species 8472 actually Star Trek Voyager's best aliens? That's next month. I'll be back then and a bunch of times before then, so until the next time you see me, whenever that is, thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.